The wind was a blade, honed on the endless, desolate prairie. It sliced through Sarah's threadbare shawl, finding the thin fabric of her dress beneath, chilling bone and spirit alike. Snow, fine as powder, whipped across the frozen ground, obscuring the horizon, blurring the line between earth and the bruised, gray sky. Her boots were worn past mending, each step an act of will against the biting cold and the gnawing emptiness in her belly. Beside her, Eliza, small and bundled, trudged silently, her face pinched with cold, her eyes wide and fixed on nothing. They had been walking for what felt like forever, leaving behind the ghosts of a life lost to fever and foreclosure. There was nowhere specific they were headed, only away from the unbearable familiarity of grief, deeper into the unforgiving vastness. Hope was a fragile thing, easily shattered by the relentless wind and the ache of hunger. Despair was a heavy cloak, threatening to pull them down into the drifts. They had stopped near a cluster of stunted, skeletal trees, offering scant protection. Sarah huddled Eliza close, rubbing her small hands, trying to coax warmth back into her fingers. That's when she saw him, a dark shape against the pale snow, tied to one of the trees. Fear, sharp and sudden, pierced through her weariness. Could be a trap, a bandit's snare. But curiosity, and the desperate need for something different in their endless, bleak march, held her rooted. Leaving Eliza tucked behind a scrubby bush, Sarah crept forward, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. As she got closer, the shape resolved into a man, bound tightly to the trunk with heavy rope. His face was bruised and swollen, a dark contrast to the snow. His clothes were fine, expensive wool, ripped in places. He was slumped, head bowed, barely moving. Not dead, but close. The wind worried his hair, plastered it against his clammy skin. Sarah hesitated. What good could come of this? He was likely involved in something dangerous. Helping him could bring trouble down on them, trouble they were ill-equipped to face. But looking at the raw vulnerability etched onto his face, seeing the slow, shallow rise and fall of his chest, a different kind of ache settled in her chest, a weary empathy. He was suffering, alone, like them. Eliza's quiet presence, her absolute dependence, was a silent weight. Could Sarah walk away and leave another human being to freeze to death? It felt like burying a piece of her own soul alongside her husband. With a deep, shaky breath, she moved closer. The rope was thick, cutting into the tree bark. His eyes, when he lifted his head slightly, were dark pits of pain and distrust. They locked onto hers, assessing, wary. She said nothing, just reached for the ropes, her frozen fingers fumbling with the knots. It took long, agonizing minutes, her strength failing, the cold biting deeper. Finally, with a last, desperate pull, the rope loosened. He crumpled slightly, a low groan escaping his lips. He was heavy, a dead weight against her smaller frame. Getting him to their meager shelter, a half-collapsed sod dugout she'd spotted earlier, was going to be another impossible task in a life full of them. Yet, she began to drag him one slow, arduous inch at a time, the wind screaming its disapproval around them. The dugout offered only a marginal improvement over the open prairie. It was damp, smelling of earth and decay, but it blocked the wind. Sarah managed to drag the unconscious man inside, near the spot where she coaxed a meager fire from damp kindling she'd scavenged earlier. Eliza huddled beside her, watching the man with wide, silent eyes. Sarah looked him over properly by the fire's weak glow. He was big, broad-shouldered even in his weakened state. His injuries were significant, deep cuts, likely broken ribs, the brutal marks of ropes on his wrists and ankles. This was no random act of violence. Someone had intended for him to die out there. She found a waterskin tucked into his belt, surprisingly still mostly full and not frozen solid. She managed to get a few drops to his lips. He stirred, moaned again. Carefully, using strips of fabric from her own petticoat, Sarah cleaned his wounds as best she could. Her movements were slow, precise, the automatic actions of a woman who had nursed through fever and dealt with life's inevitable injuries. He flinched under her touch but remained mostly still. He was a stranger, a potentially dangerous one. Yet in their shared vulnerability in this harsh, unforgiving place, he was simply another soul clinging to life. Sarah had so little: a few dry biscuits, a handful of beans, a scrap of dried meat. Food she needed desperately for herself and Eliza. But leaving him to starve after saving him felt wrong. She crumbled a piece of biscuit into a cup of water and offered it to him. He finally opened his eyes fully, dark and intense, fixing on her face. Suspicion warred with something else, perhaps weary acceptance. He swallowed the thin gruel, his gaze never leaving hers. "Why?" His voice was a low rumble, rough with disuse and pain. It was the first word he'd spoken. Sarah shrugged, pulling her shawl tighter around Eliza. "Couldn't leave you." He absorbed that, his expression unreadable. He looked a man used to command, used to being feared, yet here he lay utterly dependent. She felt a flicker of fear again. What if he was one of the brutal men whose reputations were whispered in hushed tones across the territory? What if his enemies tracked him here? They had nothing to protect themselves. Eliza leaned against Sarah, her soft breathing a counterpoint to the man's labored one. Sarah looked at her daughter's trusting face, then back at the man. "You have a name?" she asked, her voice quiet. He hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "Jedediah. Jedediah Stone. Jedediah Stone." The name was heavy with meaning. The Stone Empire, vast ranches, thousands of head of cattle, power that stretched across counties. This broken man tied to a tree? The legendary Jedediah Stone? Disbelief warred with the evidence before her eyes. His enemies weren't just cruel. They were audacious. And now, she and Eliza were inadvertently tied to him. Fear coiled tighter in her stomach. She had saved a rich man, perhaps the richest man for hundreds of miles. But what did that mean for them? He was a wolf pulled from a trap, but he was still a wolf. And they were just two lost sheep in the wilderness. All she knew was that for now he needed care, and she was the only one to give it. Her resources dwindled with each passing day. Days blurred into a cycle of feeding the meager fire, rationing their food, and tending to Jedediah's slow recovery. Eliza, losing her initial shyness, would sometimes sit near him, showing him a smooth stone or a feather she'd found inside the dugout. Jedediah, surprisingly, didn't chase her away. His dark eyes would follow her, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. He spoke more now, short, clipped sentences asking questions about their journey, where they were from, where they were going. Sarah answered truthfully but minimally. There was no need to dwell on the pain of loss, the shame of destitution. He learned that her husband was gone, that their farm had failed, that they had nowhere left to turn. He said little about himself, only that he had been ambushed. The details, she sensed, were dangerous things he kept close. As Jedediah regained strength, the dynamic shifted. He was no longer helpless weight, but a presence, filling the small space with his quiet intensity. Sarah felt his eyes on her constantly, watching the way she cared for Eliza, the way she stretched their meager supplies, the weary strength in her movements. He saw her not as a savior, she felt, but as an equal in the grim business of survival. He was wealthy, powerful, yet here, stripped of everything but his resilience, he was just a man recovering. And she, penniless and alone, was the woman who kept him alive. One afternoon, he pointed to the small pot where their beans were boiling. "That's all you have left, isn't it?" he stated, not asked. Sarah didn't look away from the fire. Almost. He was silent for a long moment. "You used what little you had to help me." It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. Sarah finally met his gaze. "It was the right thing to do. Right things often cost dearly," he observed, his voice low. She felt the truth of that in her bones. The cost had been high. Their remaining food was dwindling rapidly. The risk of harboring him was ever present. Yet she felt no regret. A quiet dignity had settled over her since the moment she decided to cut him free. She had acted not out of hope for reward, but from a place of fundamental humanity. As he grew stronger, the inevitable question hung unspoken in the air. When would he leave? When would the world he belonged to reclaim him, and leave them once more to face the wilderness alone? There was no contract between them, no promise of repayment. She hadn't asked for one. He owed her his life, yes, but life on the prairie taught you that debts of gratitude were often forgotten once convenience dictated. A tense expectancy settled over the dugout. He tested his limbs, moved with less pain. He was ready, and Sarah knew, with a heavy heart, that his departure would leave them more vulnerable than before, their resources depleted, perhaps having drawn unwanted attention. The day he finally stood, testing his full weight, was cold and clear outside. "I must go," he said, his voice regaining some of its former authority, though still roughened by his ordeal. Sarah nodded, her throat tight. Eliza looked up, sensing the change. Jedediah looked down at her small face for a moment, then knelt stiffly, offering her the smooth stone she'd given him. "Keep this," he rumbled. For luck, Eliza clutched it tightly. He was about to leave when they heard it, the sound of hooves drumming on the frozen earth, fast and purposeful. Several horses, heading straight for the dugout. Jedediah's head snapped up, his eyes suddenly sharp and alert, the pain momentarily forgotten. "They found me," he said grimly. Sarah felt a cold dread wash over her. His attackers, coming back to finish the job, or perhaps looking for anyone who might have helped him. Their lives were now in immediate peril because of the man they had saved. Jedediah moved quickly, despite his injuries. "Get back," he ordered Sarah, his voice low and urgent. He scanned the limited interior of the dugout, his gaze falling on a rusty spade leaning against the wall. It was a poor weapon, but the only one they possessed. He snatched it up, positioning himself near the low entrance, ready to defend the narrow opening. Sarah pulled Eliza behind her, pressing her daughter's face into her skirt, whispering reassurances she didn't feel. The hoofbeats grew louder, closer. Voices, rough and mean, carried on the wind. "He ain't here. Check that hole." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. They were exposed, trapped. Jedediah held the spade like a shield and sword combined, his injured body coiled with a dangerous energy. The low doorway darkened as a figure dismounted and peered inside. Before the man could even fully register what he saw, Jedediah moved, striking out with the spade's edge. A cry of pain, a scramble. Another man was right behind the first. Sarah, propelled by a surge of adrenaline, grabbed a heavy piece of firewood and hurled it towards the entrance. It wasn't much, but it caused a distraction. Jedediah used the moment, engaging in a brutal, desperate struggle in the confined space. The sounds were sickening grunts, curses, the thud of blows. Sarah shielded Eliza, watching with terrified eyes as Jedediah fought with a ferocity that belied his injuries. He was outnumbered, weakened, but he fought like a cornered animal. The fight spilled just outside the entrance. Sarah heard the heavy thud of a body falling. Jedediah reappeared, bleeding from a fresh cut, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "They're gone," he rasped, leaning against the entrance frame, the spade clattering to the ground. "One won't be riding anywhere." The others ran. He looked down at his hands, smeared with blood, then back at Sarah and Eliza, his expression complex. They had been hunted, and they had survived together. The shared danger had forged an unspoken understanding, a bond deeper than gratitude. They had not just saved him. They had fought alongside him, proved their resilience, their loyalty, not through words, but through action. The immediate threat had passed, but the air in the dugout remained heavy with the aftermath of violence. Jedediah, leaning against the damp wall, closed his eyes for a moment, regaining his breath. Sarah watched him, the raw reality of their situation settling in. They had faced down his enemies, but it only underscored their vulnerability. Where could they go now? They had nothing, and his presence had only drawn more danger. Jedediah pushed himself upright. He looked at Sarah, then at Eliza, his dark eyes holding a depth of emotion Sarah hadn't seen before. The guardedness was still there, a habit of a lifetime perhaps, but softened by recent events. They were rivals, he said, his voice low and steady. Been trying to take pieces of my land, my business. Thought if they killed me, they could divide it up easier, he paused, assessing her reaction. Sarah simply listened, her expression calm, outwardly betraying little of the turmoil within. She had guessed as much. Power struggles, greed. The same forces that had ground down her own small life on a different scale. You saved my life, he continued. Twice now. He gestured vaguely towards the outside, towards the men he had just fought. They wouldn't have stopped. They would have found you eventually, asking questions. Or worse. He walked over to where Sarah sat with Eliza. He knelt, wincing slightly so he was closer to their level. He didn't offer platitudes or simple thanks. His gaze was direct, unwavering. I owe you more than I can repay with money. But money is a start. He reached inside his torn coat, pulling out a thick wad of bills Sarah knew instinctively was more money than she had ever seen in her life. This is yours. For saving me, he held it out. Sarah looked at the money, then back at him. It represented security, food, warmth, a future for Eliza that didn't involve scraping by on the edge of starvation. But something held her back. Accepting it felt like a transaction, reducing their act of compassion and their shared ordeal to a simple debt. It felt like an end, when something within her felt irrevocably tied to this man and the strange turn their lives had taken. She met his gaze steadily. We didn't help you for money, Mr. Stone. A flicker of surprise crossed his face, quickly masked. He studied her for a long moment, a different kind of assessment this time. He saw not just a woman who had saved him, but a woman of principle, of quiet strength and dignity, forged in the fires of hardship. He saw resilience that mirrored his own. He saw the way she looked at Eliza, the fierce protectiveness in her eyes. He slowly lowered the money, though he didn't put it away. No, he agreed quietly. You didn't. He stood up, moving back towards the entrance, looking out at the vast, silent prairie. My life. It's not an easy one. It's built on struggle, on taking risks, on defending what's mine. I need people I can trust. People who see things clearly. People who act not just for gain, but because it's right. He turned back to her, his expression serious. I need a partner. Someone to stand with me, to help build something lasting. Not just for today, but for tomorrow and the days after that. Sarah stared at him, stunned. Partner? He wasn't offering charity. He was offering a place by his side. A share in his world, the very empire whose name carried such weight. It was a proposal as audacious as the attack that had brought him low. It wasn't about her past, her lack of standing, her poverty. It was about the woman she had proven herself to be in the crucible of survival. I can't promise it will be easy, he said, anticipating her hesitation. But I can promise security, a home, a future for Eliza she deserves, and a partnership built on the truth we've found here. He finally looked at Eliza, a hint of a smile touching his stern lips. She needs stability, a place to grow. Sarah looked down at her daughter, her small hand still clutching the stone Jedediah had given her. The endless uncertainty, the biting cold, the constant fear of the past months. It all receded slightly, replaced by the breathtaking possibility of Jedediah's offer. It wasn't just rescue, it was reinvention. It was being seen not as a victim of circumstance, but as a survivor capable and strong. It was taking the dignity she had clung to in her despair and building something tangible with it. She rose slowly, standing tall. She looked from Eliza's hopeful face to Jedediah's resolute one. The prairie wind still howled outside, a reminder of the world's indifference. But within the damp walls of the dugout, something new had taken root. Resilience was not just about enduring. It was about transforming. It was about finding strength in vulnerability and building unexpected futures from the wreckage of the past. Mr. Stone, she said, her voice clear and steady, finally stepping towards the dawn of an uncertain but hopeful new life. I believe we have much to discuss.